So welcome to this webinar. It's hosted by Living Lakes Canada, Friends of Windermere Creek, and the Lake Windermere Ambassadors with support from the Regional District of East Kirby. We are recording this webinar for those who are unable to make it. We'll be sending it out afterwards. So I just wanted to acknowledge that while folks may be joining from many different areas, we're currently presenting from the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa and the Secwepemc Nations, who have stewarded this land and the water for generations. This is a quick overview of how the next hour is going to look. This project came about from residents expressing their concerns and wanting to learn more about the groundwater supplies. We have 5 speakers who will be presenting data that's been collected and how it's being used and how it could be used in the future. So as you can imagine, there's a great deal of information that's going to come in the next hour and a half. We'll be hosting a Q&A at the end of all the presentations. We welcome you to put your questions into the chat so that you don't forget them throughout. And then lastly, we'll be sharing a survey at the end of the presentation to get some feedback on how we've done and how we could improve this in the future, and also gauge your interest in potential future events. I'm just going to quickly jump into who I am and who the Lake Windermere Ambassadors are. So we're a nonprofit water stewardship organization with a vision of healthy waters for healthy communities within the region. So we conduct a number of water monitoring and community outreach events. I joined the Ambassadors in 2018, and I have a background with a Bachelor of Science in Outdoor Recreation and Conservation, and have worked with other nonprofits in the past. We've been collecting water quality and quantity data on Windermere Creek since 2007, which started with the Mainstream's Columbia Basin Water Quantity Project. Today we collect weekly water chemistry and water quantity data from May until September, and have a continuous flow logger in the creek that and conduct annual cabin sampling, which looks at the macroinvertebrates as bioindicators of the health of the creek. I also work with Living Lakes Canada as the local reference group coordinator for the Kootenay-Columbia region. The goal of this project is to take a region-wide approach to better understand the current water monitoring occurring within the region, traditional and historical knowledge, where the data gaps are, and how to address those gaps to ensure that we have a comprehensive picture of water availability within the Columbia Valley and subsequently for the basin as a whole for future water budget needs. Windermere Creek is a stream of interest to be included in this project based on the existing diversity of local uses and interested parties wanting to address the water use and challenges on the creek. If you're interested in getting involved in this project, I will share my contact information in the chat. I'm now going to pass it off to Carol, who is the Groundwater Program Manager with Living Lakes. She's going to share the data that they've been collecting on Windermere Loop Road.
Super. So our objective today is to share the data that Living Lakes Canada has been collecting on groundwater in the Windermere area. Living Lakes Canada is a nonprofit organization that facilitates collaboration for monitoring, restoration, and policy to protect Canada's lakes, rivers, wetlands, and watersheds. The Groundwater Monitoring Program is a community-based project to collect data on how groundwater levels change seasonally and year to year. So today I'm going to present some background information on our program, some background information on groundwater in mountainous environments, and then I'll speak specifically about the groundwater level data that we've collected around the Windermere Loop Road area. So for the groundwater monitoring program that we're running, as I said, it's community-based. So we partner with existing well owners to identify wells that we can install groundwater level monitoring instrumentation into to track how groundwater levels change seasonally and year to year. So the wells that we're monitoring aren't supply wells, so they don't have pumps in them. Basically, we're looking to find the background water levels. And so what we do is we measure the distance from the surface to the water level, and we collect a measurement hourly. We then compile these data, and we can look to see how the trends change seasonally and year to year. So for example, this is actually a well we're monitoring down by Creston. We have here the depth of the water below the ground surface, and then we've plotted that against the calendar year from January to January. And so what we can see here is that levels decrease and increase, and we can look at those changes throughout individual years, and also the changes that occur between years. The goal of our program is for the data that we collect to inform different water management and protection initiatives. And so we share the data publicly in two places. One is on the provincial BC real-time water data tool, as well as the Columbia Basin Water Hub. So two of the wells that we are monitoring are in the Windermere Loop Road area. So for those of you that don't know the area, it is east of Lake Windermere. This is Invermere here. So Windermere Loop Road comes along here. It's adjacent to the golf course. This is the Rocky Mountains here. So it's right at the base of the mountains. And then Windermere Creek comes out of the mountains and down into Windermere Lake, and then flows north into the Columbia River. So this area here where we're interested in water levels is about 100 meters above Windermere Lake. In 2018, residents along Windermere Loop Road came to Living Lakes because they were interested in learning more about their water supplies. So the homes in this region along Windermere Loop Road are all on private domestic wells. Throughout the Columbia Basin and in the interior of BC, groundwater is extremely important for water supply, as many rural homes are on private domestic wells. We also know that groundwater is extremely important for providing flows to creeks and surface waters, keeping them cool to provide habitat for fish. So if we have a look at the Columbia River here, which flows out of Lake Windermere north to Golden, what we see here, all the blue dots are wells and the green dots are surface water licenses. So again, just realizing how dependent this rural population in this area is on groundwater, as well as on surface water. And that, of course, the mountains, many of you have probably heard of the concept of mountains being, the water towers that are providing water to the lower elevation areas. And what's interesting to note is that a lot of these wells that are along the Columbia Valley Trench, they are on the east side at the base of the Rocky Mountains here. So really important within the Columbia Valley. Groundwater is important for both people and nature, both within the Columbia Valley Trench and throughout the interior of BC. So what do we know about groundwater in mountainous areas? Well, groundwater is found in the fractures of bedrock. So if we've got bedrock here, there's obviously cracks in it, and water will infiltrate and fill the cracks in bedrock. We also know that the groundwater is found in the spaces between sand and gravel. So in here, between those spaces where there's sand and gravel. So the areas where groundwater can be extracted using a well, that's called an aquifer. And these aquifers here, you can see in this diagram, here are some sand and gravel aquifers that are denoted by these yellow these yellow places here, they can be separated by layers of impermeable material, so things such as clay and silt. So here's an example of an aquifer where it's exposed to the surface here, and then it's confined by this clay layer here. In our mountainous environments, the aquifers are generally small and fragmented, and this is because of the types of subsurface materials and the way they were deposited. So in our mountainous environment, we don't have large aquifers like we see in the Great Plains. We also can see aquifers can be connected to surface water, so where water can move freely between the aquifer and a creek, both in the valley bottom and at higher elevations up here. The connection between groundwater and surface water and how water is moving back and forth between them is really dependent on the local conditions. So in the Windermere Loop Road area, these wells are primarily drilled through various layers of sand, clay, and gravel. So a lot of variety in the types of materials that we see in the Windermere Loop Road area. So aquifers that don't have an impermeable layer, so if there isn't a layer of clay or silt that water can't penetrate, when we drill a well into that type of aquifer, the water level will move up and down based on the zone of saturation. So this would be what would we consider a water table well. We can also drill wells through impermeable layers down to what we call confined aquifers. So in a confined aquifer, there's impermeable material above and below it. And in this case, the water level that we see in a well that's drilled into a confined aquifer, it'll rise based on the pressure in that aquifer. We like to classify aquifers as confined or unconfined, but really they're not simply one or the other, especially in our mountainous environments. We often find that an aquifer will be confined, but it'll have regions where it's unconfined and the other way around as well. So confined aquifers, they're generally recharged through cracks in the bedrock, or from areas where that aquifer is exposed to the surface or another aquifer. So these water levels will change, of course, seasonally throughout the year, depending on the amount of snowmelt, precipitation, and how much of that precipitation and snowmelt is infiltrating into the ground versus how much is running off. So again, our water levels are going to change both based on the amount of precipitation, the amount of infiltration, and then how fast that water can move through the ground surface, or the subsurface, sorry. So what do we know about the aquifers in our area around Windermere? Well, the provincial government has an aquifer mapping program. So this is where they take existing information based on things like geology, topography, surface soils, as well as the information that drillers collect about the subsurface materials that they encounter when they drill. So they've mapped, the provincial government has mapped 104 aquifers in the regional district of East Kootenays, so in this area in here. Most of these aquifers are along the valley bottoms where there is a history of human use and wells have been drilled. The province has a provincial groundwater monitoring program where they're tracking water levels in aquifers throughout the province. There are 4 in the East Kootenay Regional District, so 4 aquifers that are monitored by the province. 2 are down near Cranbrook, 1 in Wassa, and 1 down by Jaffrey. And all of those provincial observation wells are at low elevation in the valley bottoms. And so when we think of Windermere or some of the other areas, we're interested in also what's happening in the other aquifers, and so that we can get aquifer specific information as to what's happening with groundwater levels. So the Living Lakes Canada Living Lakes Canada monitoring program is targeting different aquifers throughout the entire region. So this information on aquifer mapping by the province, it is available publicly. And I'll show you the link on the next slide where you can find this information. So looking at our study site here on Windermere Loop Road, these are the private domestic wells along Windermere Loop Road. The province has mapped two main aquifers in this area. One is the bedrock aquifer, and then overlying the bedrock aquifer is this larger aquifer, which they've numbered 545, which they've identified as a confined sand and gravel aquifer. So it's got layers of impermeable material above it. Again, it's not fully confined. The aquifer mapping report says there's zones where it's unconfined, and that they actually think there's multiple stacked aquifers in this region. So it's actually not one big aquifer, but there's lots of different layers of different materials. So these aquifer mapping reports, they can be found on the GWells database. There's the address there to access it. The GWells database also has the registry of all of the wells in the province that have been drilled, that have been registered. You can see here, I've mapped in the GWells database, this is Windermere Loop Road, our area of interest. And these are the properties along Windermere Loop Road and the wells that have been drilled. Prior to 2017, when the Water Sustainability Act came into force, it was optional to register your well with the province. Now that the new Water Sustainability Act is in place, all well drillers are required to register all of the wells that they drill. As a well owner, I recommend you check to see if your well is registered and that it's in the right place on the map. The database is used for many things, including aquifer mapping and groundwater management and licensing. So the better information we can have about where the wells are and where water is being extracted, better management decisions can be made. So as many of you probably know, when the new Water Sustainability Act came into force in 2017, that brought in groundwater licensing. So those of you that are homeowners that are on private single domestic wells, you don't need a license for your private well, but all other ground users must apply for a license. The benefit of a homeowner, if you are on a private domestic well, to register your well, it then becomes known to the province that you're extracting water for personal use, for domestic purposes. And so if you're not in the well, in the database, they don't know you're collecting, they don't know that you have rights to the water there as a private homeowner. I also think it's important to check your well just to improve the database and the information we have. Again, the database is something that's been compiled over many years, and there's been transcription errors, et cetera, as the database was developed. So we found a bunch of wells that were in the wrong spot when we started our project and when we started looking for wells to monitor on Windermere Loop Road. So we worked with provincial staff, and we've moved these and put these wells in the correct spot. I do suggest, though, as well owners, you go in and check for your well in there, and if it's not registered, to register it. So the well reports for the wells along Windermere Loop Road here, most of these reports say that the wells were drilled in a mix of sand, gravel, and clay. So we're seeing a large variety of materials in this area. We worked with the homeowners to try and find wells in this area that didn't have pumps in them, and we've found 2 wells that we've been monitoring since 2018. So one of these is on the east side of Windermere Loop Road, and one's over here on the west. These wells are not used to supply water. They're only about 500 meters apart. And although they're at different depths, one's at a higher elevation than the other, so the bottom of the wells are at about the same depth. So the part you guys have all probably been waiting for, what does the data show us and what have we seen? So what we have graphed here is the water level in meters below ground surface. And then we have the calendar year on the bottom here from January to January. A lot of hydrologists will report water levels on the water year, which goes from October to October, but we've plotted January to January here. And each of these colors represents a different year. So blue is when we started monitoring in October 2018. And what we see is that water levels are decreasing in the spring. We're seeing lowest levels occurring in June every year. And then the water levels rise again. And the highest water levels we're seeing are in late fall here, and then they decline again. The range that we're seeing in the wells on Windermere Loop Road is about 0.5 meter. So if we look at the scale here, within a year, it's changing about 0.5 meter. What we do notice, this aqua color here is 2021. So our 2021 levels are lower than the previous 2 years. This is what we're just compiling all our data from all of our wells throughout the Columbia Basin. And we have found that in general, with the drought conditions and low precipitation we saw this summer, many of our wells are showing lower levels than previous years. So again, just if we plot this continuously here, what we see is when we started monitoring in October 2018, that decrease, then it increases, decrease, increase. But what we are observing is within the 3 years that we've been monitoring, we can look just qualitatively here and see that over the last 3 years, we've seen a decrease. We're seeing the same thing in the other well that we're monitoring, because we are monitoring 2 wells on Windermere Loop Road. The gap in the data here and here is because we had to pull the logger to use for another project. So what we can do is we can look at the data and the trends that we're seeing at Windermere Loop Road and compare them to other areas in the region. And so over here on the left-hand side, these are 2 wells that are located in the valley bottom. So OW 309 is a provincial monitoring well located up in Golden. It's directly connected to a stream near the valley bottom at 809 meters above sea level. And then we're also monitoring a well down here in the floodplain between Toby Creek, which it flows into the Columbia River. And what we see in these wells that are on the valley bottoms is that we see the water level trends are very similar to what we see in creeks and surface waters in our region, where water levels are stable through most of the year. And then we see the peak flows or the highest water levels occurring in the spring months associated with snowmelt and runoff and precipitation, and then water levels decrease again. And so what's interesting is we've got our well over here on Windermere Creek or Windermere Loop Road, where we are, 100 meters higher above the valley bottom. And what we can see is a very different trend in the water level response in the wells. We are monitoring another well to the north that's also about 100 meters above the valley bottom in a confined aquifer up near Briscoe. What we see in this well is that water levels start to rise early in the season and around March or April, where we don't see that rise down here in Invermere. We think what's happening here is that this well is influenced by an irrigation well that's nearby that's being pumped. We need to do more research and confirm this, but this well is being influenced by active pumping. One thing that we do notice between all the wells that we're monitoring, so this one over here in Athelmere, the green is the water level data from 2021. And what we see in this well is that the water levels that we measured this fall were lower than all previous years. Same with our well in Briscoe. We saw water levels lower this year than the previous 2 years. And as well in Windermere, in this case, our data from 2021 is shown by this aqua color. And again, it's lower than the previous years. I'm going to turn it over to Antonio, who's been working with GW Solutions. He's been advisor to Living Lakes and helping us manage and interpret the data. So I'm going to turn it over to him to do a bit more of the data interpretation and to present a 3D model and other work he's done to further characterize the groundwater system around the Windermere area. Before I pass it over to Antonio, I just wanted to say thank you to the well owners who volunteered their wells for monitoring. Without them, we wouldn't have this data for the aquifers in this area, and as well to our advisors, volunteers, and supporters who've been supporting our community-based groundwater monitoring program. So I will turn it over to Antonio.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thanks. My name is Antonio Barroso. I'm a hydrogeologist. I'm with GW Solutions. I'm currently the president of the company. The previous president, Jill Wendling, also founder of the company, is in the process of retirement. So I've been in this position for the last 2 years now, and working with Living Lakes Canada for approximately 4 years since we started the volunteering monitoring program. We did this work within Windermere Creek. We started last year and we finished in March this year. We have a report, and I think it's publicly available through Living Lakes Canada. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation is the groundwater levels and climate. I'm going to provide a preliminary understanding why the water levels in the area are declining. The declining trend is also observed in other observation wells in the area. I'm going to talk about a little bit about construction of water wells because we notice that some of the wells in the area are constructed in a different manner. And I just want to highlight the importance of constructing wells following different guidelines. I'm going to present our 3D hydrogeological conceptual model that we developed for Windermere Creek. And the findings will be corroborated by levels and water chemistry, and also conclusions and recommendations. Before I start with my presentation, I really want to thank and acknowledge Carol for all the work she's been doing up in the Columbia Basin. She has now over 23 observation wells operating and recording water levels, hourly water levels. That's an amazing achievement for, you know, the amount of wells. You know, she's basically monitoring 3 times aquifers than the province. I think it's something to recognize that people that are involved in groundwater monitoring, they will understand how hard it is to implement a monitoring site, communication with the well owner, and then sign agreements, and then look at the data, validate the data, and then upload to publicly, systems such as Aquarius in this case. I think that work is great, Carol, and I'm very proud to be involved in this project with you. So for the water levels, so as Carol mentioned, observation well 10 and 11, we observed declining trends since 2018. I look at the precipitation data at the site. The closest station that I had access to was the Cranbrook, 100 kilometers from the observation wells in Windermere. And I look at the precipitation records for the last 40 years. I plot here monthly precipitation since 1990 all the way to July or September. So I have 30 years, and I use this method of cumulative precipitation departure curve to be able to assess if we had wetter years or drier years. And here we have the zero. Whatever is positive means that the precipitation is being higher historically, and wherever you have negative, it's been drier. And then we have a trend as well. If it's increasing, means we have wetter years through time, and if it's decreasing, we have drier years to time. In this case, we noticed that the climate is suggesting that we had wetter years all the way to 2013 with this increasing trend in precipitation. And then since 2013, we have this declining trend in precipitation, which suggests that the water levels in wells, especially that respond to precipitation events, will have a declining trend similar to the precipitation patterns. And that's exactly what we observe in observation well number 10. Unfortunately, we don't have that many years of data for this well. Carol started monitoring this well since 2018. However, we know that the lowest recorded groundwater level was in 2002, this year. The other aspect, when we look at the observation wells, we just produced this well log for this observation well. We know the depth of the well is 48 meters. The lowest water level in this well was observed at 46 meters. So that gives us only 2 meters of water column, available water column in that well. If you were to put the pump in it, you probably won't have enough to serve a home. The observation well number 11, you have a bit more available water column, probably enough for a domestic use. But when you have this fluctuation, that definitely limits the amount of water that you can get from your well. I look at another well in the area, again in Cranbrook, and a well, observation well 291 is a provincial observation well. It's completed in bedrock aquifer 523. And you can see here, I have the blue as the precipitation departure curve. Again, it's increasing through time. And then in pink, I have the water level in observation well number 291. And as you can see, in the last few years, we've been having this declining trend as well, probably a response to this precipitation pattern. But in this case, the fluctuation is more than 5 meters. It's typical in bedrock wells where you have, larger groundwater fluctuation, but the pattern is very similar to the precipitation events. And I want to talk about a little bit about the construction of water wells, and why you don't have enough water in your well sometimes. There are different factors that will affect to to the productivity of your well. One is construction, the construction of your well. You know how deep is the well. If it has a screen in it installed at the bottom, you know. And then the aquifer characteristics, how transmissive is your aquifer, is the material in your aquifer allows flow of water. Typically, sand and gravel aquifers are very transmissive. However, if they have clay content or silt content, it will limit the flow of groundwater towards your well. And then the available water column. If you have a, you know, if the water table is up here, then you will have higher capacity to pump this well. So those are the factors that affect the productivity of your well. I noticed that some of the wells in the area in Windermere Creek, they don't have screens. And that's probably a limiting factor for how much water you are getting in your well. So I just want to highlight the importance of having a screen in a well. Typically, a well with a screen, you will have 40 times larger amount of water you can get into your well. Also, with the well without a screen, you don't have a filtration system, and also you can start pumping sediments from the bottom and eventually putting at risk of collapsing your casing if you start pumping a lot. The only probably disadvantage with the screen will be probably you will require rehabilitation of your well, you know, from time to time, probably every 10 years, every 5 years, you will have to clean your well, but you have the other benefits. I want to talk about the 3D model that we developed for the area. The study area is presented in this slide. You can see the upper watershed and then the glassifluvial sediments here. As Carol mentioned, there are two main aquifers. One is confined that also is called as unconfined, and it could be multiple stack aquifers. That's the sand and gravel, and also the bedrock aquifer that is located everywhere, basically. The data inputs for the model were mainly the GWells database, the water wells, the reported wells within the provincial database. That's a great source for building hydrogeological models. At the site, we have 20% of the wells are shallow wells, less than 15 meters. Most 40% of the wells are between 15 and 50 meters. 35% of the wells are completed at depths of between 50 and 100 meter deeper wells, and 5% of the wells don't have any completion details. That's actually a pretty good, you know, I would say it's pretty good reporting system. 5% only don't have construction logs, so that's you know, it's a high detail. Then the other source that we included in the model is the 1 meter LiDAR topography. That's the one that you use from the province as well. And then we generated this model, and for this presentation, I'm just gonna show different cross sections across the site. This is Windermere. This is Windermere Loop Road. The observation wells 10 and 11 are located here. I have 3 cross sections to go through in this presentation. Section A and the upper reach of in the Windermere Creek. And then I have section B and the lower reach. And then I have a river profile along Windermere Creek that is section C. As you can see, Windermere Loop Road observation wells 10 and 11 are located here. You can see the completion. Those little cylinders are wells. I have to distinguish 3 types of aquifers, or two main systems: the overboarding aquifer system and the bedrock system. Within the overboarding system, we have an upper aquifer, likely unconfined, and in some areas is confined, such as here. There's a tail there. There are other aquifers, middle aquifer. Some wells are completed in the lower system, and lower aquifer, such as this well, very deep well. If you move along this fence, you will find wells here that actually are completed in the bedrock. You can see there probably water was found in a fracture. But then as you move south, you have the upper aquifer, the unconfined aquifer, but the water level is very low. That's why the wells there are not very productive. You know, it's the water level is a limiting factor for your productivity. Then I will go to the section B. I will move a little bit lower to the lower reach, and I have Windermere Creek there, almost right at the bridge. And I have the upper aquifer as well here. The wells are shallower. In this case, we have the bedrock aquifer, and we don't have any wells here completed in the bedrock aquifer. We have some in the lower aquifer, some in the middle aquifer. And something to notice here is that the level in the creek coincides with the level in the upper aquifer. This suggests that the groundwater and surface water are strongly connected here, likely the upper aquifer discharging into the Windermere Creek. And then I'm gonna show the last profile that is along Windermere Creek. I'm starting from the upper reach here and going all the way to discharge to the lake. And you can see here the upper section, this is the river bottom. The level in the aquifer is lower than the river bottom, which suggests the Windermere Creek will lose water towards the aquifer. However, as you move down gradient, you have the water level almost coincides with the river, with the creek. And then in the lower section, the water level in the aquifer is higher than the river, suggesting that this is a really strong discharging zone for groundwater towards the creek. The other aspect that is worth noting in this cross section is that the recharge mechanism in this aquifer is likely coming from the mountain, such as shown here with these arrows. And also you have a portion that comes from direct infiltration from precipitation. Probably groundwater is moving from here towards this side. And we use the water levels in creeks and groundwater to corroborate that assumption, as well as chemistry. So I will assume these wells will be fresher water, and as you move down gradient and you sample these deeper wells, will have older water, so we'll have different water signature. And that's exactly what we did with this work. We look at for example, we had access to this Water Survey Canada station. Fortunately, this is an inactive station. However, we can see that the high water flows are observed June, July. You can see there. But the water level in the wells are kind of delayed. They have a delayed response. They have the minimum water levels are in June and July, with the higher water levels probably in November. We had access to levels at the mouth of Windermere Creek. However, I believe the data is not fully complete, especially for the wettest period. But you can see the behavior in the other months is very similar to the groundwater system here. And the last point was the water chemistry. We had access to a sample from a well close to observation well number 10, which is completed in that upper aquifer with the low water table, water level, and then 2 extra groundwater wells samples located along this highway in the lower reach, and 1 from the Windermere Creek at the mouth of Windermere Creek. Water chemistry, as I mentioned before, it will help us to understand how old could be the groundwater, and also trying to understand the recharge mechanisms. So for example, fresh water will recharge here, and as groundwater seeps through the sediment and reach the aquifer and moves along the aquifer, will be in contact with different materials in the aquifer, sometimes overboarding, sometimes bedrock, and it will get more mineralized. So we expect that all the groundwater will be mineralized. Typically, surface water systems are classified as calcium bicarbonate, So fresher water and older water will have different signature. In this case, we have the Windermere Loop well, it's calcium bicarbonate, and the other two wells and the well at the mouth, and I mean the surface water sample at the mouth is a different water type. So in conclusion, for our little study, we noticed that the declining trend in groundwater levels observed at the Windermere Creek and in other parts at the site were due to the precipitation patterns as was presented. Groundwater level in most of the wells are near the bottom, especially around Windermere Loop Road, which limits the productivity of the well. And the other aspect is the provincially mapped aquifers are probably an oversimplification of the complex system at the site. We identified that at least we have three different groundwater systems: an upper aquifer, maybe a middle lower, and a bedrock aquifer. The other aspect that we found with this project is that the groundwater is providing base flow to the creek, especially at the lower reach. And the main recharge mechanism for the groundwater system are mountain front recharge and direct infiltration from precipitation. And the last point, we had access to limited information, and I understand probably there are other stakeholders in the area that have other types of data. Our recommendations is to identify and protect richer areas, continue and expand monitoring of surface water station groundwater. Groundwater, we only have two, the ones operated by Living Lakes Canada, observation well 10 and 11. Probably it will be ideal to move number 11 to a different aquifer in the lower reach. And climate stations, unfortunately, I didn't have access to any climate station at the site, but probably there is, mines and other stakeholders that have data that it will be great to have access to that information. And surface water, as I mentioned, there is one at the mouth of Windermere Creek and one inactive in the upper reach. And then we recommend characterizing the groundwater and surface water interaction along the creek. One aspect that we strongly recommend is to register all the wells with the province, so other people, other researchers could use this data in order to come up with researchers like studies like this. And the other aspect is to consider completing the new wells with the probably installing screens. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Antonio. So that's a summary of the data and the analysis that have been done by Living Lakes Canada and its partners around the Windermere Loop Road area. We really hope that all this information is especially useful to the homeowners around that area. We also hope that it'll help inform future projects, such as the restoration of Windermere Creek. We know there's a lot of interest in restoring Windermere Creek, so we hope that this 3D modeling work and the groundwater work that's been done in this area can inform these other projects, as well as improving our understanding of groundwater systems in mountainous regions in general. As we talked about, a lot of the interior of BC is a mountainous region, and so many rural areas are dependent on groundwater, as well as our small creeks and surrounding ecosystems. So next we've invited John Bissett to provide just a really short overview of the work that Shuswap Indian Band and his project have been doing in the Windermere Creek area. So John, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Carol. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm John Bissett. I'm a consultant, and our team is providing support to the Shuswap Indian Band and partners. So just a quick background. CHARS is one of a number of projects we're using to identify, prioritize, and restore tributaries to the Columbia River between Canal Flats and Mica Dam. So CHARS is actually a strategic name that we've chosen. It stands for the Columbia Headwaters Aquatic Restoration Development Strategy. But CHARS is also a group of fish that bull trout, brook trout, eastern brook trout, and lake trout are part of. And one of the important things about CHARS or char, like bull trout, for example, is that they have strong connections and reliance on groundwater. So the work that Antonio and Carol and others have talked about is really critical in integrating our understanding of processes in the watershed. Next slide, please. So some of the priorities we have and the key concepts for CHARS, it's a partnership led by the SIB, Shuswap Indian Band, and Columbia Wetland Stewardship Partners with local partners and champions. So we're working with Living Lakes Canada, like Windermere Ambassadors, Friends of Windermere Creek, specifically to Windermere Creek, Lake Windermere Rod Gun Club, and many others, as well as the Tinaka and other First Nations folks as well. Our project's data-driven and data-based, and it's built on developing an understanding of the current conditions using historic knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, interviews with local residents, some of the water quality data, literature research that we can obtain from other groups, air photos and LiDAR imagery. Putting all those pieces together and then starting to use those to prioritize some of the tributaries for restoring for species like West Slope cutthroat trout, which are a federally listed species at risk, bull trout, which are species of concern, and also salmon and merman. So we're looking at water chemistry, water quality, water quantity, bugs, fish, and all the animals within the watersheds. And we're trying to, through our project and other projects, share that information and start to build an understanding of these systems. And working with local champions like the Friends of Windermere Creek, start to systematically address and mitigate or restore some of those impacts. So next slide, please. Some of the key project components that we're collecting through CHARS, which really support and add to the benefits of the work that Carol and Antonio and Natasha and others are doing, are some of the hydrometric data. So we have hydrometric stations or flow stations on a number of tributaries like Shuswap Creek and Galena Creek and others, so that we can compare the flow trends in Windermere Creek to those systems and see how things have changed. And then also using some of our water temperature data, look at changes in the water temperatures to see how suitable those systems are for the fish species. We're also collecting fish species composition information. So we have 5 biomass stations on Windermere Creek, for example, that the Friends of Windermere Creek and the province can use to identify things like pure strain West Slope cutthroat populations above natural barriers.